For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sheila McElwraith. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science, a candidate CFAR AI chair at the Vector Institute, and I'm also an associate director here at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Before we begin today, as we do with all of our seminars, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. These and other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island developed complex and effective governance systems based on respect for all life and the intelligence of the natural world. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people who are working to reclaim their rights to self-determination and self-government. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Although we may all be joining from different places today, we encourage you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you live and work on. Thank you. So before we begin and I turn things over to Barbara, just a few logistics things. As with all of our sessions, this session is being recorded. Today's session is a little different than our usual seminar structure. Barbara will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be passing things over to my colleague, Steve Coyne. Steve's an assistant professor, CLTA, in the philosophy and computer science departments, who heads the philosophy arm of our Embedded Ethics Initiative. He'll be leading us through an interactive discussion where we'll be retiring to 3 different breakout rooms for a short period of time to brainstorm some questions provided to us by Barbara. She's giving us homework in her talk. So we'll have we'll brainstorm together for a period of time, and then we'll have a brief report back from each of the breakouts, followed by a more fulsome standard Q&A session. So you'll be able to ask different questions, but it may be the case that we turn back to the topic of our breakouts. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, just to encourage unfettered discussion, but the Jamboards, we're going to be using Post-it notes and Jamboards, which are really easy to use and fun. Those will be part of an artifact that will come out of this session. So with that in mind, I'd like to again switch gears and say that it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Barbara Grosz, who's the Higgins Research Professor of Natural Sciences in the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University. To those of us in computer science, and I'm sure there are lots of us here, and in particular for those of us in AI, Barbara needs no introduction. Her research has made fundamental advances in natural language dialogue processing, in theories of multi-agent collaboration, and also in the innovative use of models developed in this research to improve healthcare coordination and science education defense. Barbara has always been an outspoken advocate for ethical practices in AI, long before it was sort of a thing, if you will. And she's widely known for her role in the establishment and leadership of interdisciplinary institutions, such as this one, and for her contributions to the advancement of women in science, something that's important to many of us. More recently, Barbara has co-founded Harvard's Embedded Ethics program, which reflects many of her sensibilities, and it integrates the teaching of ethical reasoning into core computer science courses. And of course, it was an inspiration for a program that we're running here at the University of Toronto as well. For her many contributions, Barbara has received a number of prestigious awards and recognitions, including the 2009 ACM AAAI Alan Newell Award, the 2015 Ichkai Award for Research Excellence, and the 2017 Association for Computational Linguistics Lifetime Achievement Award. These are big deal awards. The list is longer, so I just chose a few. So, and with that, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Barbara Grosz. Barbara, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much, Sheila, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the recently published U.S. National Academies report on fostering responsible computing research, foundations and practices, and you'll see the reasons for the subtitle as I give this talk. So it might seem the need for responsibility is new, and that it comes from moving from recognizing cats and dogs to recognizing human faces. In fact, there's a long history of people in computing research, some of them thinking about responsibility and ethical and societal challenges. It's now become urgent, though, for everyone to take it seriously because computing technologies are used by every citizen of the world, and And the global reach of computing research advances and the speed with which they're deployed has meant that there are many more implications and many more potential impacts. There are diverse populations and cultures. They have divergent values. So there's an increased potential for perpetuating structural biases, for unanticipated and adversarial uses of technologies to happen. These next images are meant to show two things. One on the left, that it's not just artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the top image is an image from some theoretical work on the kidney exchange program. And the bottom is an image of planning transportation in a city where historically minority neighborhoods have had more disruption of highways, and that's something that you don't want to continue. One might ask about the image on the right. This is a pottery from the San Ildefonso Native American reservation in the US, and I put it there to illustrate that culture and values is not just faces and human beings. There was an article last spring in the New York Times referring to a technical article about Native American high school students participating in a program on big data and tagging of black and white photos of. One of them was of hundreds of Native American children lined up outside one of the boarding schools that were set up in the 19th century, both in Canada and in the United States, to supposedly to get students to assimilate, but really they erased indigenous cultures. The computer app that the students used generated tags like human, crowd, audience, and smile. The high school students generated tags like genocide, tragedy, cultural elimination, Native children. So artifacts as well as individuals are important to keep in mind. Oops. I want to begin with the study scope, which is summarized on this slide. What's special about this study is that the committee investigated all areas of computer science, not just computer security, crypto, and AI. It focuses on research. This is a foundational level from which technologies evolve. And that's particularly important as the speed with which research gets picked up in applications has become much faster, and the time distance much shorter. And you see this in systems conference papers appearing just about the same time that the work is going into production, with various kinds of machine learning advances like GTP3 and applications within months of the research being published. So there are many reports that start with principles and focus on deployed systems. Here we're focusing on the research level. We aren't focused on government. We didn't address government regulation or ethics associated with the conduct of research itself, though I'll return to the first of these toward the end of the talk. And I want to note also that interacting with that these advances are powered by return to the government in a bit. The advances have been powered by two interacting ecosystems with many types of actors. So the outer ecosystem includes academics, researchers in research institutions, industry. There was another National Academy study labeled the Tire Track Studies in 2021 that shows how much the flow goes back and forth. It's not a one-way flow. Industry, the flow to industry is ideas, technologies, artifacts, and people. The flow from industry not only generates problems with potential impact, but also industry can provide wisdom from experience. The inner ecosystem is those people actively engaged in sponsoring or hosting research. And then, of course, there are also corporate leaders. So the report comes in, there are 3 core sections to the report, and I'm going to talk briefly about each of these in turn. Since it's not a mystery story, I'm going to let you see very briefly what the types of recommendations are that we make. In particular, there are in blue at the top left are recommendations that would suggest changing the research program and its scope. Below that are recommendations related to educating computing researchers, preparing them, enlightening them, coaching them, and expanding the computing research talent pool. So different people and different areas of scholarship. Oops. And on the upper right, we have various recommendations that are essentially gatekeeping related to proposals and results that reflect on making sure that the first 4 recommendations and their sub-recommendations are followed up on. And then there's a recommendation related to best practices in computing itself and engagement with the public. Arriving at these recommendations, we drew on 2 areas of expertise, 2 sources of expertise. The committee itself, which you can see from the left column of this slide, included a variety of areas of computer science and engineering, and also information science and people involved in tech deployment. But we also had members of the committee whose expertise is in the social sciences, in philosophy, and in law. In addition to the study committee expertise, we brought together experts in 4 domains of computing technology, and we chose those as at the top of the list on the right. We chose those because the impact of innovative computing technologies in these areas is apparent from the news, both positive and negative. There are many intrinsic ethical values at stake, such as autonomy, well-being, justice, and collective self-determination. And understanding what works and what doesn't work in deployment sheds light on the changes needed, not only there, but also at the foundational level that enables those innovations. We also had people from leaders in computing industry research centers and federal research sponsors. And the goal of those public meetings and discussions was to gain an understanding of how the study might help these enablers of research of progress. And you can see them reflected back in some of the recommendations for sponsors and institutions that support research. Okay, so that's background. I want to turn to this chapter 2 of the report, which describes some core ethical concepts and methods from the social and behavioral sciences. So if we're going to, as we ask computing researchers to take on incorporating a wider scope of research, we thought it was important for them to understand what ethics was and what it wasn't, as it might apply in this arena, and also to understand some of the social sciences that are important. So effective engagement is going to require that scholars in the humanities, that computing researchers engage with scholars in other fields. I want us to highlight, especially for any computer scientists in the audience, that this does not carry an expectation that computer scientists and engineers will get a 2nd or 3rd PhD in these other areas of scholarship, but rather the recommendations identify multiple routes for computing researchers to acquire familiarity and appreciate the value of work in other fields, and for students to develop a talent pool of students and also current researchers who have these capabilities. Okay, so let me turn then to a one-slide overview of ethics, and this is with apologies to any philosophers in the audience. It's very high level, but is intended to get across where this report focuses on ethics and the kinds of ideas that thinks are important for responsible computing research. So there have, as I mentioned earlier, been several reports that lay out principles for computing technologies. The US government just issued another one a few days, maybe last week. These are important goals, but to lay out a principle like the system should be governable, or it should respect human dignity, or it should protect privacy, doesn't tell anybody how to do it. And that disconnect from practice is a gap that this report aims to fill. Why? Okay, so that's one piece of background. The second is that there are many interesting theories of ethics in philosophy, but that is important in philosophy and less important here. So what this report, it's not the theory will give you explanations for choices, but not say how to implement, identify or resolve them. Implement identifying or resolving them. So what this report does instead is to lay out some fundamental ethical values that are important in computing research, and that takes values as the fundamental building blocks of moral theories, and looks at the issues that arise in trade-offs among values when you have, as I said earlier, when you have different populations who are affected, different stakeholders, and different cultures. So, for example, you can think about traffic and workplace cameras in terms of security or in terms of privacy. There are going to be trade-offs. How do you make that trade-off? In the workplace, you can think about work schedules. Do you optimize those for employee autonomy or well-being, or for employer profits? So these are the kinds of issues that are discussed in that chapter. One of the important points it makes is, however much computing researchers would like a checklist, there isn't such a shortcut for ensuring the right kinds of attention to ethical and societal impact concerns. That said, researchers can work together in different areas of computing research to develop implementations of the recommendations. So we're giving a path forward toward responsible research rather than a checklist for it. So that's ethics in one slide. And I will now give you socio-technical perspective and social science methods in one slide, and again, with apologies to people who work in this area. People individually, in families, at work, in communities, members of society, interact with and are affected by computing technology. So we're all tied up in the material, technical, and social worlds that created by computing research, and we also influence them. And it can be, and this is true in the design of even simple systems. So the two scissors above are meant to just remind you that for many, many decades, probably centuries, there were scissors for right-handed people, but not left-handed people. So this need to look at who the people are who might use it and make design decisions taking them into account is important. And it is also the case that there are design decisions in what computing researchers might think of as purely technical work, and the kidney exchange and map examples I gave before. Some of the lessons that can be learned here by using the methods of the social sciences from the many disciplines that I've listed below, and that's a partial list, are to come to understand the diversity of stakeholders, their varying values and power relationships, that the idea that there's a universality of user, that there's just one type, most often doesn't hold, that it's hard to predict future uses, and that, as the scissors show, implicit values are implicit often in design, and therefore it's important not to just leave them implicit, but to be explicit about it. So one could say, and this is this is from me, not the report, but computing research that ignores social context does so at its and humanity's peril. Okay, back to the report. So the third chapter of the report takes to heart our first conclusion about computing and responsible computing research, which is that it needs to expand to include consideration of ethical and societal impact concerns and a determination of effective ways to address them. Chapter 3 provides reasons behind all of this. It describes a set of generators of ethical and societal impact challenges in research and in the later deployment of research advances and technologies. It's these generators that lie behind this first conclusion. So I do want to note here that many of the examples in this chapter come from panelists who met with us and were in the public session, whose stories are about confronting ethical challenges arising from use of technologies that embed the results of research. It is still the case that at the foundational level of research, researchers provide role models, and it is important for them in developing these technologies to think ahead about intended uses, consequences, anticipated and unanticipated uses. Okay, this is a list of the kinds of roots and inherent limitations that we found in doing this investigation of causal roots and inherent limitations. There are 5 groups of them, and I am going to speed through giving you one example of each. There are many more examples. Interactions of societal settings with computing technologies includes the broad level societal issues like human dignity and the environmental impacts of computing research and its outcomes, and the risks of extreme events with if something in computing research leads to a system failure. It also includes problems inherited from historically from ways societies have worked. And then bridging these, there are computational challenges that bridge these 2 cases. So I'm going to give you an example of just one of these. Well, I am going to give you an example of one of these, which is aligning with existing norms, structures, and practices. So in both work and labor, there are existing practices. There are varying levels of power and varying values. And this slide, I hope you'll read it in parallel with my talking, can lead to questions like, who are the optimizations designed for? Whose benefits are being optimized? Human computer interaction designs, who is that being done for? And what are the resource needs of users for the methods to be successful? So both in work and labor settings and in healthcare, and here there's an example from the pandemic where there were the community of vulnerable children, telemedicine just didn't work for them because it wasn't even clear who would fill the role of parent or guardian for contact. So just some examples of that alignment. Okay, the second area was limitations of human capabilities. Much has been made of, you can fix the problem by putting a human in the loop. So I love this quote from Sullenberger. He is the airplane pilot who landed a plane in the Hudson River, who notes that it's actually harder to manage a system, and you need more training and experience. It's a system that's highly automated than one that's not. There are also, there are also issues of opaque systems and open worlds. In opaque systems, people can't understand why they do what they do or perhaps how to use a system appropriately. in open worlds, there are unexpected events that often have very bad consequences. There are also issues of pro and anti-automation bias. And the report gives examples of all of these. The third category, societal influences on design and deployment. I'll just contrast here Sepsis Watch, which engaged from the very beginning the people who are going to be using the system. So sepsis is a big cause of death in hospitals, and they're all trying to get rid of it to lower how much there is. So Sepsis Watch was a very careful study of all of the stakeholders, producing a system that in its empirical testing was useful to people. And because it included the relevant stakeholders. And this really is tightly tied to our second conclusion, which is to be responsible, computing research needs to engage the full spectrum of stakeholders and deploy rigorous methodologies and frameworks that have proven effective for identifying complicated social dynamics. So from the start, not just at the end, in all of the stakeholders. And then there are two other categories we looked at: best practices for computing systems. And we also discussed two cases, privacy and content moderation, where it is very important to recognize that computing research and computing researchers can help, but these are problems that cannot be solved by technology alone. For example, design choices between efficiency, privacy. If you think about content moderation, a single word or a video clip may be fine in some contexts, but not in others. So very quick view of some of the generators of these intentional problems. And now I want to do a quick tour of the recommendations in brief. Let me remind you of the categories. I'm going to talk, and Sheila mentioned there would be an exercise that's going to focus on recommendation 2, but that works in conjunction with recommendation 1. These are arguing for changes in the research program. Not only researchers, but also the full community of sponsors and institutions are going to need to change what they do. Recommendations 3 and 4 are about differently educating, preparing, and enlightening people. And here again, and here in particular, it's scientific and professional societies, research sponsors, and institutions that need to take responsibility, no pun intended, for this. And I'll focus on 4 the most. 5 and 6, I'm actually not going to talk about. They are gatekeeping proposals, as it were, and research sponsors for proposals and conferences and journals and scientific societies are important for getting publications and artifacts to come out, right? So that's just important, but we won't be discussing that in any detail today. And then for recommendation 7, it's researchers, and for recommendation 8, it's universities, sponsors, and scientific societies, but I also will not be talking about that recommendation. Okay, so, to move to the recommendations themselves. The first recommendation, and this has, again, it comes from the first conclusion that we have to include a consideration of ethical and societal impacts of computing research and technologies. They have to be first order concerns of the computing research community. And that means we need to bring in participants from the social and behavioral sciences, and also engage from the beginning expertise in any domains of application that are envisioned. One more important thing is the importance of reporting not only what it is that systems and algorithms can do, but also what their limitations are. So each of these underlying bullet points has its own sub-recommendation. Recommendation 2 is focused is focused on generating new kinds of projects, and will and bringing in and enabling that kind of research to happen. So the community has to value that research. Sponsors and institutions have to value it. And in particular, the last two bullet points here are important, which is there have to be sufficient resources for people who are not computer scientists, who are from outside. And also not only resources, which is from sponsors, but also performance review processes need to take them into account. So the third recommendation again reflects this and focuses on enabling students and researchers to gain expertise in the relevant fields. And I just want to say again that we're not asking them to become PhDs in these areas, but to learn how to work with people and appreciate the literatures in other fields. And the two recommendations provide practical ways for that to happen. Here for this recommendation, I just want to tip my hat to the University of Toronto for their embedded ethics program, and not only designing it, but also evaluating it in very interesting ways. So the kinds of expertise that, and so that's about kind of formal education and training programs. Recommendation 4 focuses on different kinds of expertise that researchers may need to find, and they may not find in their own institution. So grounding in application domains, the various areas of scholarship. Not every college or university or industry has a philosophy department, for example, or a social science department. And we'll be looking at this more in the exercise. Next, adhering to best practices. It's very interesting. It was, in fact, very interesting in the committee discussions that people would bemoan the lack of attention to best practices in their own area of computer science, but people in other areas. So there's much more to be done here within research, and then as the research goes forward. Okay, so I want briefly to highlight who has the power to change these different aspects of computing research ecosystem, and to emphasize also that it's really a collaborative effort of many players. They're the people who are doing research in the research community, the enablers, sponsors, and institutions, the, as it were, insurers that things are done right, the sponsors, scientific society, and publishers. And to make the point that the committee debated, I will say, rather vociferously on ways to make these recommendations practical and yet not too prescriptive. It recognized that there are many different kinds, we recognized that there are many different kinds of institutions, many different kinds of domains, and some things can be done by individuals, but others require the effort of the whole research community. And that's why you see in the left column here, different kinds of responsible parties for the different recommendations. I'll finally note that from the committee, this is again a personal observation, from the committee experience itself and other experience I've had with multi and cross-disciplinary efforts, collaborations are needed not only to carry out the recommendations, but to define evaluation and review criteria, and to design workshops and programs. So in the exercise, as we focus on recommendation 2, there it will be useful to think about research sponsors and research institutions and what they can do to help the research community. As we look at recommendation 4, it will be important to look at what those not only those institutions and sponsors can do, but also what the scientific and professional societies can do. And finally, for those in a breakout room discussing computing, the need for best practices, those of us who are computing researchers really need to do better. And I hope that we'll be able to come up with some ideas. So let me make one more point before we turn to the exercise. And this last slide reflects our third conclusion, which is that the full scope of responsible computing requires other actors. So we provide some guidance and indications for what governments, regulators, industry can do to establish policies and regulations, and what the role of researchers is in assisting them by revealing, for example, limitations of their research. And we see this because innovative technologies most often draw on multiple research results. Their design involves many trade-offs. Science and engineering can help, but they can't do it all. We can provide decision makers with the information they need, but all of these other players need to engage. So the determination of norms and value trade-offs belongs with societies and communities. The development of mechanisms to realize those belongs with government, and entrepreneurs, investors, and corporate leaders have an important role to play as they shape incentives and develop established governance. So with that, I'm going to stop and just mention that the point of the short exercise we're going to do is to help identify specific actions that some of the actors I just mentioned to you can do to address the challenges these recommendations raise for the individual researcher, especially in the research community. So each room will have a different prompt focusing on a different recommendation, asking you to think about concrete steps to take. What we hope you'll do in the room is to have people from different fields of study, different perspectives, different work contribute to the list, and think about more than one educational, societal, or cultural context. So I think it's over to you, Sheila, at this point.
That's right. And all I wanted to do was very quickly thank you for your talk, which was incredible. And also more generally, thanks for chairing this important study along with your committee members who did so much work, and thank you for summarizing it so concisely. I feel like there's so much in that report, but there's so much more to do. And I think that's exactly the work that we're going to do in the next little while. So I'll just turn it over to Steve Coyne, who's going to guide us through our exercise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheila and Barbara. So hi everyone. So I'm going to be facilitating some breakout discussions about how to concretely implement the recommendations in the committee's report. So in a moment, each of you will be placed in a smaller breakout room. And so you'll be able to use the chat and audio there. Now, each breakout group is going to have a moderator, and the moderator is going to put a link in the breakout room chat to a Google Jamboard that contains a discussion prompt. So I'm just going to very quickly show you what that looks like. Okay, so you should see once once you navigate to the link that's given again in the breakout room chat. This is what you should see, and it contains some background information and the prompt that you're going to be discussing in your breakout room group. Once you've had time to read the prompt, you should navigate to the next frame on the Jamboard, and you'll have an opportunity to post your ideas, responses, and thoughts. And so you should use the sticky note function. So you're going to all have great ideas. So there's a great idea to put in, and it can put there. And if, by some means you need more space, there's a second identical Jamboard to put that. So without further ado then, I'm going to start the breakout rooms now.
Steve, we all need 5 more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes. I guess, I don't know whether we're all back or just my breakout room.
Yeah, I think it's everyone's back here. So, so we should keep the schedule rolling. So welcome back, everybody. So I hope you had useful and thought-provoking discussions. So at this point, I'm going to invite the moderators from the groups to summarize the results of their group's discussion. Starting with Diane in group 1.
So here's our Jamboard, which I'm sharing with everyone. And wow, we could have used more time too. We spent much of our time talking about the importance of multidisciplinary work to all of this. And so in the yellow on the right, 2 practical actions that we came up with were creation of multidisciplinary faculty appointments and also promotion of multidisciplinary work. And in blue, we identified some points that kind of speak to what will help make it a successful multidisciplinary enterprise. And these included coming to agreement on vocabulary when we're coming from all different fields so that we're not speaking at cross purposes, and focusing at least initially on methods rather than getting hung up on what the outcomes are going to be, but being open-minded about that and talking about the methods instead. And we identified that there are lots of challenges in multidisciplinary work, from ordinary boring stuff like who if you're cross-appointed to multiple departments, who do you owe how much service to, and how do you split yourself and have a real presence in both, to much more consequential issues like how will your file be looked at tenure time. And one person brought up the issue of solo authored papers being really important in some disciplines, and so how do you do that when you're doing all this collaborative work and have it respected in your own home department? That's where we spent a lot of our time. On the left-hand side, we had some good ideas that we didn't get a lot of time to talk about really at all, but we talked about some efforts towards education of the community in different ways, like having an awareness campaign, which could reach people at any different part of the picture we've been discussing, or projects for students, capstone projects that require multidisciplinary involvement. And then 2 ideas were put forward to do with enforcing or ensuring that these things actually happen. And one was having some kind of accreditation, and another was defining competency requirements. So that was us.
Thanks. It looks like you covered a lot of ground. So I'm going to invite, I guess, David from group 2 to discuss what his group went through. And actually, I forgot to suggest this with Diane, but it'd be great if you could read out the prompt first.
Sure, absolutely, Steve. So our prompt was, how can researchers and institutions, so I'm going to make this full screen. Oh, okay, never mind. Our prompt was, how can researchers and institutions who are developing new projects that focus on societal benefits or harm mitigation best partner with philanthropies and corporations to develop and enable those projects? So our discussion really focused on the partnership aspects and some concrete steps there. This was, personally, I thought a little bit of a challenging prompt, but it's a good one to think about. So we talked about some things like potential joint appointments, and kind of talking here about both joint appointments with industry, but also potentially joint appointments with philanthropic organizations. We kind of talked about kind of various other mechanisms of doing these types of partnerships, building on existing academic structures like sabbatical projects, workshops, residencies, internships. I personally talked about grad student funding a little bit, or grad student internship opportunities. We talked quite a bit about potential challenges that also kind of, that might kind of muddy the waters. So for example, we talked about issues like trade secrets and IP and proprietary technologies or systems that might kind of propose potential barriers between in these types of partnerships. We talked a little bit about kind of the idea of 2 different people from 2 different places, researchers and corporations, potentially being value aligned, but not necessarily kind of like procedurally or budgetarily aligned. And so how it was important to really establish these relationships, both from the people level, but also in the kind of the more policy and I don't know, a legal sense. And so this last point that I'll kind of raise in the top right over here, we kind of talked about how there might be challenges, but it's still important to try. It's still important to kind of pursue these opportunities even when things are a bit unclear or we might see potential barriers. So there was a lot of talk about how even though there was a lot of talk about how We might leverage philanthropies or corporations and other institutions to bring people together to really kind of commit to working together to form these partnerships. I think I'll stop there. Barbara, you were in our room. Is there anything you wanted to add about that?
David, you did a great job of summarizing, so I will let the next person, I'll let Sheila go. Thank you very much. Nothing to add.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Now I can stop sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, David. So yeah, let's jump over to Sheila from group 3.
Yeah, so hi, everybody. I'm not muted, good. So my prompt, our group's prompt was the following. What steps can the research community, for example, researchers, sponsors, institutions, take to ensure that released artifacts and systems developed using research advances adhere to best practices for system design, deployment, oversight, and monitoring? We had quite a small group, and it was actually a not very unbalanced group. We had a number of computer scientists, which in some ways is good for this particular question, but perhaps not as diverse as we might hope for in other ways. We spent a lot of time at the beginning just sort of debating, I guess there were differing opinions, so which we could have discussed for the whole time, sort of debating whether or not, and I'll just read, ethical concerns seem relevant. One person posited that ethical concerns seem relevant to computer applications, but not so much to basic computer research. For example, what are the ethical considerations with bee trees? And so, of course, we embarked on a sort of restricted conversation about the fact that perhaps not every issue in computer science research manifests itself in manifest ethical dilemmas, but there are certainly many that do. And so we were encouraging focusing on the things where we could actually make change. There were some general observations, and I think that many of us agreed with this, that really, and I think this echoes Barbara's sentiments as well, that this requires a major cultural change. This is not going to happen overnight. Computer science really needs to change the way they do research, the way they do system design, deployment, oversight, and monitoring, and that these are just baby steps in terms of the practice. Certainly there was some interest in an advocacy for making ethical considerations a design principle of when we do research, as well as development and deployment, and identifying stakeholders, thinking about the downstream impact, not just the immediate users, but others who are differentially impacted by the actions that we take, in the same way that first world nations are being asked nowadays to take responsibility for how our actions may be changing climate and affecting people in Pakistan and other places in the world. And so there were a number of sort of theme observations related to those sorts of themes. In machine learning, researchers could point out that their results depend on their data sets, being responsible with respect to identifying the limitation, what data sets you are using. Is your work reproducible? Are you delivering it in a way that other people can test it out, make sure that it is replicable, and then also exposing the applicability of your technology or of your research to a particular, that it's applicable to one scenario, but perhaps not to another. Also recognizing not only the benefits of a technology, but also the misuses of a technology, how a technology can be misused. Finally, there were observations by some computational linguistics researchers or machine learning researchers that some of this is already happening. And I mention this because I suspect not everybody here knows this, but at machine learning conferences now and at computational linguistics conferences, researchers are really encouraged to discuss not only the positive aspects of their research, but also the limitations, to really expose the dirty secrets behind when things, not only when things work, but when things fail, to discuss the societal impact of those technologies, and to encourage people to really think about how their technologies not only can be used for good, but how they can be misused in an unintentional way. So those were some of the things that we talked about. I think we just scratched the surface. We needed about another hour and a half for this, but certainly another 10 minutes. But I want to thank the people in my group for what they did come up with.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. So thank you to the moderators for your work in summarizing and leading your groups. And thank you to all the participants for engaging in such a productive and apparently very specific discussion. So I'm also impressed at how much all of you could fit into a single one of those notes. The font got really small in some of them. But yes, so I'm going to hand things back over to Barbara now for her final remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to everyone for being willing to try this experiment of having a breakout group in the middle of a talk. Some final observations and reflections. So yes, it was a very challenging exercise. It will probably take years for the community to develop all of these. For those who raised some of the questions that Sheila and David mentioned, I hope you'll read the report. There are probably the most frequent thing I've heard from computer scientists about the culture changes. Well, I'm a theorist, and so I don't need to worry about it. And the report actually deals with that particular issue. But of course, what you said, Sheila, is right. It's probably not bee trees, but it is kidney exchange optimization. So I just want, before we turn to the Q&A, I really want to thank you for brainstorming that. These are really interesting ideas, and I hope people will think about them going forward and think about other things that can be done. The report makes recommendations for practical steps. To take those steps require implementation plans, and this exercise was meant to be an example of the beginnings of that kinds of discussions. Those plans will vary by area of research. It will certainly be different in theory from systems, from data management, from AI, from type of institution and intended application domain. So it's going to require focused efforts of different communities, and also that they share. It is really asking to change the scope of computing research and change the way in which computing research is assessed. And I think that seems to have come out in some of the breakout groups as well. I want to note also, it's crucial to do this in research because the foundations for what will follow in deployment, in the methods and the systems development, are guided by the design and decisions that are made during the research. So it's important for the research to set the foundation where these ethical and societal concerns can really be taken into account. And thank you all for engaging a bit in doing that. And I think I will stop here and ask for questions.
And I'll just add, if people can raise hands in order to ask questions, we get that gives us an ordering of who whose question is first. So Monique, thank you.
So Barbara, thank you for presenting the report. It was for me here at Schwartz Reisman as the executive director, I found it very resonant with a lot of the discussions that we've been having around, particularly in our policy research. And I was wondering, when we think about things like how we should be redesigning our regulatory systems, how do we start to balance things like a government commitment to public accountability with also what appears to be an increasing need to draw on experts to kind of explain what's happening in terms of the technologies. I know in the report you mentioned that computer scientists can share the limitations of their data or the limitations of the research findings, but this requires I think a certain level of trust with the experts. And a system with with policymakers and experts that is still considerate of public trust and accountability of government. So it seems quite complex. How do we approach that in a meaningful way?
So first, let me say I applaud the efforts already going on at SRI. And I should have mentioned actually in relation to comments from the third breakout group that the report does refer to we recognize there are a bunch of ongoing efforts, including the ones that you mentioned, Sheila, in the computational linguistics, natural language community, and the machine learning community to begin down these paths. So some of what we were able to cite in the report is showing the plausibility of the recommendations is because there have been efforts ongoing. Monique, you highlight one of the hardest areas to crack. I think there are open questions about what really needs to get revealed about systems and how to reveal it. So I think that the challenge here is to get people who have been involved in some of this movement from research into development and deployment in the room, talking with each other, perhaps saying, suppose in the 1990s, we didn't decide that all regulation was going to be bad for the technology industry to go forward. That might have been true in the 90s. It's no longer true now. So let's put that off the table and ask the question of where and what kind of regulation and what kind of policies we need to develop. And I think there are some industry people beginning to think about that. Probably not enough, but maybe institutions and organizations that try to bring them together can find the people ready to take the steps. I think maybe one lesson I've learned from not only multidisciplinary work, but also from my work on improving the situation for women and minorities in science is that you want to start with the people who are ready to do the right thing and then show how it's an advantage to them to do it. And then the other guys will come along. So I think if we try and do it all at once, it will be too hard. But if we try to take first steps, we can, I have confidence there are enough smart people out there who care that we can do it. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question.
So I don't immediately see anybody with their hand up. So while people are pondering their questions, and we can certainly go back to the breakout, some of the discussion of the breakout room questions, maybe I'll take advantage of my position and ask Barbara a question that sort of keeps me up at night. And maybe it's a question that doesn't have a good answer, but I worry that, you know, we are not a monoculture on this earth. We are a world of different communities with different values with respect to individual rights, individual human rights and rights of the collective and different priorities. And when I think about anything that we might be able to deploy, for example, in our very reasonable Canadian country, even, you know, perhaps juxtaposed with some of the more conflicted neighbors to the south, I just can't imagine that we will ever be in a world where even with our best efforts, we will be able to do something that will allow other people to control technology, so that the technology and the research that we're doing really will be in the societal benefit in some ways. I can't see how we're going to get there. I don't know whether that's not a well-formed question, but can you say anything that will make me?
Oh, I will. Okay, so Sheila, your question, like Monique's, is a very good question and a very important question. And probably you notice that the report really focuses on Western liberal democracy, so to speak, on those values which we have had for many years, and I hope your neighbor to the south will continue to have them. So there are no easy answers here, and a step toward trying to lower the number of occurrences of your nightmares about this is to maybe shift the question some and think not about how we can do it so that nobody can do the wrong thing, to thinking about how we can combine doing the right thing with developing ways of monitoring and cutting off people who are not doing the right thing. So that it's, and I know that there's some people in the corporate setting trying to work this out. I think it will take corporations and politically very sophisticated people who are involved in, negotiating things about the internet and so on, to actually address this. From talking with a few of those people, I know I don't know enough. But in the end, the survival of the world depends on getting this to happen.
Yeah, I very much feel that way as well. Thank you. I don't know whether we have any other questions. Oh, Tony.
So I actually have two questions. The first one is, I do machine learning, and the examples I've seen of what people call unethical is, for example, machine vision systems, which were trained on mostly images of white people and don't work so well for black people. And then, so when the police use them, the black people get it. It doesn't work well, so many black people look like a known criminal, for instance. Okay, and they shouldn't be. And this seems like a bad thing for sure. But it seems to me this seems to be most of the problems, ethical problems raised with machine learning, as far as I can tell. And it seems to me it would be enough, isn't it enough in this field to say things like be sure your training set reflects your your user set, right? And this is just a standard statistical thing. Every statistician knows that any statistical result is only valid on a population with the same distribution as the training set. And that's just good. That's not even ethics, that's just good science, right?
Okay, so I can only do one question at a time. Yes, that's a lot of the focus, but it's not, of course, it's the general question of the data set reflecting the full community of people impacted by any system that we put out there. So in healthcare, for example, in the United States, at least, women weren't part of studies until the 1990s, or maybe no, the 2000s. There were all medical experiments, including the ones on mice, by the way, were just males because women have hormones, so that might mess up the results. So there is no question that justice and racial disparities are a big issue, but it's far more prevalent than that. And it is for the reason you say, but this is an example of where the culture really has to change so that people are using the data that they should use given the applications they're envisioning, not just the data that it's easy to get. So you're right. But I think that the difference, and by the way, students need to learn what it is to design it right, which I think they teach in statistics, but I'm not sure that everybody takes those courses. So it is an example. It's not, of course, the only example of where there are ethical problems. So, I mean, to answer you asked a very nice question. You said, well, isn't this just good statistics? It's not ethics. But if the bad statistics you do has adverse impact on certain populations, then it is an ethical question. So the technical flaw causes an ethical and societal problem.
No, I agree completely. But it doesn't seem to me like it's anything new. It's a problem that's been in statistics from the very beginning. You know, the population you apply the statistics to has to have the same distribution as the population you develop the statistics on. And I don't see that a culture change is needed. It's just you just need to say it more often.
Well, when in the early days of computing, somebody asked me, well, very early days, how did computers make a difference? And I said, well, people could always steal money from a bank, but now you can steal a lot of money from a bank from stealing 1 penny from a lot of people. So the scale at which it's happening and the speed at which it's happening and the global breadth does make it a qualitatively different.
Oh, that's an illegal activity, not just an unethical one. No, but I agree.
Yes, no, but I was just trying to say that the fact that there's so much more data out there, there are so many more people using it, that the algorithms are not controlled in the way they used to, changes the nature of the problem.
I can see along those lines, teaching our students not to hack into other people's systems, right? That would be an unethical thing. Don't hack into other people's systems.
So my colleague, James Mickens, in his course on distributed systems, does an embedded ethics module on hacking back.
Hacking back, okay. That's interesting.
Yes, so you can find it. You can find it on the web. You can find it on the webpage, Tony.
Okay.
So Tony, the last question was to you. Just to be respectful of people who need to leave at 4:30, I'm going to close the official part of this seminar, and again thank Barbara very much for her time and her effort, not only in speaking to us, but in helping to design these wonderful breakout sessions that our community enjoyed participating in. And also a special thanks to Steve Coyne, who contributed a lot of his time to big applause, Steve, thank you, to overseeing that. So Barbara, thank you. The discussions have just begun. I think they have not come to any great conclusion. So thank you very much. And for those who are still on the call, I just want to remind you again, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, that I encourage you to join us next week for this special seminar that we're having. It's actually in person. And Gillian Hadfield, who's the director and chair of Schwartz Reisman Institute and professor of law at the University of Toronto, will be speaking. It will be held at the Faculty Club at U of T. There will be registration so that we can do some advanced planning. And for those who won't be able to attend in person, come. If you don't register, come late, come when you can. We know some of you have to walk across campus, but for those who can't come at all, or if it happens to be, I don't know, snowing, heaven forbid, you can watch live stream, and certainly there will eventually be a recording. And Gillian's talk is titled Judging Facts, Judging Norms, Training ML Models to Judge Humans Requires a New Approach to Labeling Data. So I look forward to seeing some of you next week, and thank you again to Barbara and to everyone else who participated. Thank you.